Around 6:30 a.m. on January 18 of 1981 in Camarillo, California, about 50 miles from Los Angeles, two newspaper delivery boys discovered the naked body of 20-year-old Rachel Zendejas, an Oxnard college student and a single mom of two who had recently gone through a divorce. She was murdered in an apartment complex's carport just across the street from her apartment in 700 block of Mobile Avenue, which she shared with her brother and two daughters, who were 1 and 2 years old at the time of her murder. The police got to the crime scene and retrieved evidence. During the investigation, detectives learned that Rachel Zendejas had gone out the evening before her murder to hire a couple of babysitters to stay with her girls. She then went out that evening and came back home the following morning, after which she dropped off the babysitters. Her killer was believed to have attacked her as she got out of her vehicle after returning home from dropping off the babysitters. Her case was investigated for several years until all leads were exhausted and the case eventually became cold. However, before the end of the year, in the early hours of December 12, 1981, a neighbor called the police to report a fire outbreak at an apartment in Oxnard. Members of the Oxnard Fire Department rushed to the scene and extinguished the fire. When done, they discovered the naked body of 21-year-old Lisa Gondex in the bathtub of the apartment. Her killer had raped her, strangled her, and then set the apartment on fire. Her neighbors heard screams but did not call 911 until they smelled smoke. Lisa Gondex was a retail worker living in Oxnard, about 10 miles west of Camarillo, and she had attended a club at the Port Hueneme Naval Base on the night of December 11, 1981. She went to a disco with her friends, after which her friends later dropped her off at her home at around 1:30 a.m. the following day. She was discovered dead in her bathtub, and her killer was unknown for decades. Lisa Gondex was said to have been on a visit to Oxnard from Connecticut for a planned 2-week trip to visit a friend in the U.S. Navy. However, she ultimately decided to move to Oxnard months before she was murdered. She had made a promise to her loved ones to spend the Christmas with them. In her words, she said, "Mom, I'll be home for Christmas." Lisa Gondex had moved in with a childhood best friend and got a job at a teen clothing store in the Esplanade Shopping Center in Oxnard. Being new to the area didn't stop her from quickly making new friends. According to her roommate, Lisa Gondex was a kind person and beautiful in and out. In her words, she said, "If Lisa had $1, she would split it with you." Rachel Zendejas and Lisa Gondex cases were separately investigated from each other until in 2002, when the suspect's DNA from Rachel Zendejas' crime scene was sent to the FBI's Combined DNA Index system. A search was conducted on the criminal database for felons in order to pinpoint the killer, but it yielded no results. However, 23 years after the murder, in 2004, the investigators working on Lisa Gondex's case utilized DNA testing and later informed the Ventura County Sheriff's Office that they had linked both Rachel Zendejas and Lisa Gondex's homicides cases to a single suspect. The DNA, however, did not return any results that could put a face to the suspect, and the case went cold again. Another stunning connection about both women going to a nightclub called Huntington in the hours before their deaths was established. The club, now closed, was a hot spot across from the Esplanade Mall. In December 2019, Ventura County's Cold Case Unit took over the cases again and applied genetic genealogy, an advanced DNA testing that is used to identify possible relatives to the suspects. The investigation then provided new leads, and further DNA testing confirmed that Tony Garcia was the suspect in both homicides. Tony Garcia resided in Oxnard at the time of his arrest in February 7, 2023. He had been right under the noses of the detectives for over 4 decades. He was born in Roswell, New Mexico, but was enlisted in the U.S. Navy and stationed at Point Mugu near Oxnard. Tony Garcia was however discharged from service in 1980 but remained in Oxnard, where he became a karate student and instructor for many years. He was working as a carpenter at the time of his arrest. It is not known if Tony Garcia knew any of his victims. Tony Garcia was charged with 2 counts of murder, plus special allegations of committing murder while engaged in a rape and committing murder while engaged in a kidnapping. At his first appearance in court, he was ordered to be held without bail. Following Tony Garcia's arrest, Rachel Zendejas' brother, Roy Rodriguez said, "I am alive for this. It is my purpose to get this thing solved for Rachel." Nova Welsh was born in Jamaica on June 1957. She had a loving family where everyone looked out for one another. When she was 10, she and her family relocated to the United Kingdom to start a new life. By the age of 16, she had found herself a boyfriend and had left her family's house to move in with him when she got pregnant with their first child. They ended up having 2 children, Jonathan and Leah. They lived in a 3-story apartment in Lighthorn Avenue in Ladywood, Birmingham. Osmond Bell, Nova's boyfriend and the father of her children, was a violent person, and more often than not, they both get into arguments. Those close to Nova were aware of the toxic relationship between her and Osmond Bell. Nova had once told her sister, Valerie Welsh, that Osmond had hit her occasionally, and their neighbors who lived just below their flat said the couple would always get into arguments while raising their voices. After some time, Nova Welsh became unhappy living with Osmond Bell, and her initial love for him began to dwindle and eventually vanished, due to his constant abuse. She then found a new love and started dating and going out with another man called Wayne Newby. Just like every normal relationship, Wayne Newby often visited Nova Welsh in her flat, but this wasn't approved by Osmond Bell, who didn't like seeing another man. This caused further problems in their relationship as they constantly argued about her going out at night. According to Nova Welsh's stepsister, Sonia, the couple had a heated argument in June of 1981. Sonia, who was in the apartment at the time, said she heard screaming and went into the kitchen to see what the problem was, only to find a terrified Nova and an angry Osmond Bell who had a dishcloth wrapped around his hands. Clearly seeing and sensing trouble in the air, Sonia decided to call the police even though Osmond Bell had told her not to. The police eventually came around, but Nova Welsh didn't make a complaint against Osmond Bell. She told the police that they had been arguing and she wanted him to leave. Osmond Bell eventually left the apartment in the early days of July 1981, since the apartment was rented in Nova's name. He had lashed out because he couldn't stand by and see another man coming into the flat. It probably made him feel small. By the time all these were happening, Nova Welsh's family had moved to the United States of America, with the hope of having her and her 2 sons join them soon. Nova was loved by everyone and easily found family and friends. She was outspoken and had friends whom she told her relationship ordeals. She had once told her friend, Joan Campbell, that Osmond Bell had grabbed her round the neck so tight that she complained to him that it hurt. She also showed her friend, Pauline Davis, the marks on her neck. She said Osmond Bell had tried to strangle her because she went out at night. Days after he left, Osmond Bell would write threatening letters to Nova Welsh telling her if he couldn't have her, then nobody could. He had also threatened to kill her in one of his letters that said, "If you don't have me back, then you know what I will have to do." Nova Welsh cut all ties with him and focused on her new relationship with Wayne Newby. On the 27th of July 1981, Nova Welsh stopped answering her phone. Her mother, Lorna Welsh, had tried to call her from the United States to confirm when she would be coming to join the family, but the 24-year-old mother of 2 wouldn't pick her calls and had disappeared with no trace. Her friends were equally surprised about her sudden disappearance because it was very unlike her to leave without informing anyone. According to her friends, before her disappearance, she had dropped off her 2 children with her ex-lover, Osmond Bell, and had gone out dancing with her new boyfriend Wayne Newby and a group of friends. She returned that evening but appeared upset. Neighbors said that they had heard crying and fighting coming from Nova's apartment on the day she disappeared. They felt it was a usual occurrence as her ex-lover was known to be violent and abusive. Weeks went by without a word from Nova. Her mother became even more distressed that she couldn't get a hold of her daughter. Nova Welsh didn't show up at her job where she worked as a part-time cleaner. Her disappearance was getting worrisome to everybody around her. So, 2 weeks later, on August 9, 1981, Lorna Edmond, her best friend, reported her missing to the police. The police then came into her apartment to search for clues that could have led to her disappearance. While they were investigating her case, Osmond Bell was interviewed by the police. He knew she was missing but never reported it to the police, claiming that he thought she had ran away with her new boyfriend or visited her family in the United States. His explanation seemed logical enough, and without evidence, the police were forced to release him. The search for Nova continued. On August 12, 1981, Nova's friend, Lorna Edmond, received an anonymous letter saying that the author's boyfriend had seen Nova and the same guy she had been out with night before grabbed her and hit her. The writer was implying that Wayne Newby had something to do with Nova Welsh's disappearance. The police investigated the letter and still had no clue on what had happened to Nova Welsh. The forensics determined the letter to be truly written by a female. The police, who had interviewed Wayne Newby before, called him in for another round of interrogation. He still maintained that he had nothing to do with Nova Welsh's disappearance. On August 18, 1981, there was a shocking discovery made in the flat where Nova Welsh lived. Neighbors reported an awful smell coming from somewhere in Nova's apartment. When the maintenance team came around to search the apartment, a strong smell pulled them towards the stairs. Just beneath it, they discovered a utility cupboard, and in it lies Nova's decomposed body, covered in a blanket and newspapers. Nova Welsh, whom the police and the public had been looking for, was in her apartment, dead and rotting away. According to her autopsy results, Nova had suffered from a broken neck which led to her death. Her death came as a shock to everyone in her community. Her family in Miami was informed about the discovery, and they were so sad and heartbroken. In a bid to find the perpetrator of this evil act, the police started their investigation. The first suspect that came to mind was Osmond Bell. He was then arrested and held in custody for 4 days while the police did their initial investigation. The issue of the letter Lorna Edmond had received was brought up, and the police asked Osmond Bell if he knew anything about the author of the letter. He, however, denied it. Due to lack of sufficient evidence to link Osmond Bell to the killing, they were forced to release him again. The police did all they could to find Nova Welsh's murderer, but all efforts was in vain. After a while, the case went cold for 35 years. In 2016, when there was a significant advancement in DNA technology, detectives from the Cold Case Department were going through cold cases. They became particularly focused and hopeful in Nova Welsh's case. Her file contained a piece of chewing gum that was used to close secure the cupboard door of where her body had been found, and also, there was the letter that had been sent to Lorna Edmond. Having taken the evidence to a crime lab, they found out that the DNA on the chewing gum is the same as the DNA on the seal of the letter. After that, they got a court order to secure DNA from the initial suspects in 1981. Osmond Bell's DNA was taken and compared with that of the chewing gum and letter. Fortunately, there was a match. He was then arrested and had his trial started in February of 2017. At the court, witnesses took their stand, citing his abusive nature and the letters he had written to Nova Welsh threatening to kill her if she left him. Nova Welsh's neighbors, Carmen and Wendell Turner, who lived in the flat below, had heard what appeared to be the cupboard door being forcibly shut on the night Nova Welsh disappeared on July 26, 1981. At around 12:30 a.m. in the early hours of the next day, Carmen and Wendell Turner heard 2 bangs. They said the second bang sounded like somebody was kicking the door. Carmen said the noise could have come from the cupboard. The prosecution of the case argued that despite finding out that Nova Welsh was missing, Osmond Bell never reported to the police because he is the killer. He further mentioned that the letter and the seal of the envelope was taken for testing for DNA and it matched with that of Osmond Bell. The prosecution said he sealed the envelope to divert suspicion onto Wayne Newby, which it did at the time. However, Osmond Bell had a different opinion to that, saying his DNA must have appeared on the letter when he touched it while being subjected to a dark and terrible interrogation in the days after Nova Welsh's body was found. He claimed that during a break in police interviews, he was left alone in the room where he had been allowed to touch and read the letter. When asked by his attorney, Jeremy Dine, if he had ever been in the cupboard where Nova Welsh's body was found, he said he had been there up to 3 times while running a business restoring washing machines from a nearby garage. Osmond Bell mentioned that he had also been in the cupboard with his business partner and his brother. He said in court, "The very first time we went in was to gain access to the pipe, we were going to attach a hose to the stopcock." He further claimed to have used a discarded piece of gum as a form of filler in order to secure the door after he had forced it open. He said he had secured the cupboard by using the screws that were there and also used a chewing gum in place of glue. To him, all these explains why his DNA was found on the letter and chewing gum. Osmond Bell fervently denied killing Nova Welsh. In his words, he said, "We had 2 wonderful children and, although we had our differences towards the end, you do have feelings for the mother of your children." The prosecutor, who wasn't buying Osmond Bell's lies, said, "It's a 1,000,000,000 to 1 chance of the DNA not matching Osmond Bell. He is the man that tampered with the lock on the cupboard door and hid the body there. It would be an extreme coincidence if the killer was somebody other than Osmond Bell." However, after a long 6 weeks trial, the court determined that the murder had not been premeditated. The judge said Osmond Bell got into a fit of rage when he found out that Nova Welsh was seeing another man. Some people seemed to disagree with the judge, citing letters Osmond had written to Nova Welsh, threatening to kill her if she left him. They concluded that it was indeed premeditated. Regardless, Osmond Bell was cleared of murder but was convicted of manslaughter by an 11-to-1 majority verdict at the Birmingham Crown Court. He was then sentenced to 12 years in prison. The judge said he would serve half of his time in prison and the other half on license. Nova Welsh's family and friends are happy for the eventual justice and closure they now have. Nova Welsh's sister, Valerie Welsh, said the family had forgiven her sister's killer. In her words, "To be honest, my family and I, we forgive him, but he still need to pay for what he done." Lorna Edmond, Nova's best friend, said, "Nova was a lovely person, always happy and smiling. She was a devoted mother who loved her 2 boys very much. I often think about the old times and the things we used to do. I still miss Nova and only hope that her family can now find some peace. Nova can rest in peace knowing that justice has been done. I will never forget her. Till we meet again, Nova. Love, your friend, Lorna." Nova's mum, Lorna Welsh, said, "Finally, after 36 long years, Nova can rest in peace. The family can now have closure knowing the person who took Nova's life has been brought to justice. I would sincerely like to thank everyone involved in bringing this case to court." In her victim's impact statements, Lorna Welsh said that Nova was gentle, loving, and full of life, and that the unfortunate and tragic loss of her life prevented her from seeing her children grow up as young adults. Recently, many cold cases are being solved. Families of murder victims now have a glimmer of hope. We hope that the perpetrators of evil acts be brought to justice before they get a chance to go 6 feet under the ground. In the early hours of July 20, 1971, a 911 call went out of Burlington, Vermont when a lady contacted the police to report the murder of her roommate, Rita Curran. It appeared that the lady, who had been at work a day before, had returned to see Rita Curran in the pool of her own blood on the bed they both shared. When the police arrived, they discovered that someone had broken into the lady's apartment and had beaten, sexually assaulted and strangled Rita Curran to death. They also found evidence that Rita Curran had strongly resisted her attacker, putting up a fight. The question of who killed Rita Curran bugged her family and the Burlington Police Department for years, but the killer remained a mystery for decades despite the police looking into hundreds of tips. However, 52 years later, Rita Curran's killer was eventually identified. Rita Curran was born on the 21st of June 1947 in Brooklyn, Kings County, New York, to Thomas and Mary Curran. She was described as a kind, generous and beautiful person who wouldn't do anyone any harm. When Rita Curran turned 24 years old, in the summer of 1971, she decided to move out of her parents' home for the first time, into a shared apartment on Brooks Avenue in Burlington, Vermont with 3 other roommates whom she did not know well. At the time, she was a second-grade teacher at Milton Elementary School and had started graduate courses at the University of Vermont, while she worked during the summer break as a maid at a local motel. Unfortunately, just 2 weeks after she left her family's house, she was murdered in her apartment in Burlington, Vermont. According to police report, she seemed ready for bed the night she was attacked as she was found dead with curlers in her hair. Many people know Burlington to be a small and friendly city, but when Rita Curran was killed, it caused ripples of fear in the city because at that time, many Burlington residents left their front doors unlocked. This could explain why Rita Curran's apartment door might not be locked at the time of her murder, since the police did not discover any visible force used on the entrance door. During the investigation, police officers collected evidence from the crime scene that included a single cigarette found near Rita Curran's arm, which was believed the killer left to burn out. They also interviewed Rita Curran's neighbors and investigated hundreds of tips. Among the neighbors interrogated were a newly wedded couple, Williams and Michelle DeRoos, who lived in an apartment 2 floors above Rita Curran's at the time of her murder. They, however, told investigators that they had been together all night and didn't hear or see anything. The police had a list of 13 suspects, in which Ted Bundy was one of them. It appeared that the location of the local motel where Rita Curran worked was adjacent to serial killer Ted Bundy's birthplace, the Elizabeth Lund home for unwed mothers. Rita Curran's murder and crime scene was similar to how Ted Bundy attacked his victims, and this led retired FBI agent John Bassett to propose him as a suspect at the time. In order to find closure and to ask if truly he killed Rita Curran, Mary Campbell Curran, Rita Curran's sister, wrote a letter to Florida's death row where Ted Bundy was being held. In response, the FBI told her that Ted Bundy had refused to confirm or deny his involvement in Curran's death, and there was no evidence that firmly placed him in Burlington on that date of the murder. However, Detective Robert D. Keppel interviewed Ted Bundy, who later told him that he had murdered a young woman in 1971 in Burlington when he was there to obtain information about his birth, but, on January 22, 1989, the eve of his execution, Ted Bundy denied his involvement in Rita Curran's case to FBI Special Agent William Hagmaier. Having exhausted all leads, and without an improved DNA technology to pinpoint a suspect, the case went cold for over 4 decades. According to Burlington's acting police chief, John Murad, the department never stopped seeking justice for Rita Curran's family. In 2014, the Burlington's police department sent all the evidence collected at the crime scene, including the cigarette, to a forensic lab in New York City for DNA testing. Though the tests compiled a DNA profile of the person who had smoked the cigarette, it didn't match any DNA in databases compiled by law enforcement agencies across the country. That meant the person with the DNA on the cigarette but likely never had genetic material entered into the database, possibly because the person didn't have a felony conviction. The DNA testing also didn't match the known DNA of any of the police's 13 main suspects. However, in 2019, Detective Lieutenant James Trieb decided to try a new approach to the case. Instead of having a single detective work on the case alone, per the usual department strategy, Lieutenant Trieb decided to bring in a new team of detectives and expert technicians who discussed and reviewed the Rita Curran's case. This team treated the case as if it had just been committed. They began retesting evidence by sending the cigarette for DNA analysis again, but, this time, they used genetic genealogy, which is a process that uses DNA databases for genealogy research to identify possible family members of the person whose DNA is unmatched. After the DNA analysis, the genetic genealogy expert concluded that the cigarette DNA had strong connections to relatives of William DeRoos, the man who lived 2 floors above Rita Curran's apartment in 1971, who had been questioned alongside his wife by detectives and claimed to have been in his home during the time of the murder. The investigators then searched and found a living half-brother of Williams DeRoos who willingly provided a DNA sample. After the test, it was however concluded that the cigarette DNA belonged to Williams DeRoos. In 2022, more evidence at the crime scene including Rita Curran's ripped housecoat were sent to a crime lab in Florida where they performed new DNA extracting techniques. Before then, the detectives had sent the genetic evidence from the cigarette to a genealogy company to see if a bigger database of DNA could help them pinpoint the killer. The scientist and genealogy expert was able to match the DNA from the cigarette to William DeRoos within hours of research through genealogical records and public records. Also, finally, the DNA left on Rita Curran's ripped housecoat also matched the DNA on the cigarette butt. The investigators later discovered that William DeRoos died at age 46 in 1986 at a San Francisco hotel from a drug overdose. Shortly after Rita Curran's murder, he and his wife left Vermont and got divorced. In an interview with the police, William DeRoos' ex-wife, Michelle, who had moved to Eugene, Oregon, and had changed her name, told investigators she had lied in 1971 about her husband being with her all night in their apartment. It was established that William DeRoos had gotten into an argument with his wife on the evening of July 19, 1971 and had gone out for a walk to supposedly cool off. He returned later that night and told his wife the next morning to tell the police investigating Rita Curran's death that he had never left their apartment, warning her that his past criminal record might unfairly make him a suspect in her death. Detective Thomas Chanette, who interviewed Michelle, said he didn't believe she knew William DeRoos had killed Curran, but was protecting him because they were newly married and obviously in love and he had a criminal record. After their divorce, William DeRoos moved to Thailand and became a monk. He then came back to San Francisco, United States in 1974 where he met his second wife, Sarah Hepting. Sarah Hepting said in an interview with Burlington Police that William DeRoos had a penchant for sudden outbursts of violence. She said there were 2 instances where he had been extremely violent around her. One of which was when they both were having a conversation with a female friend and he had taken a pocket knife and stabbed the woman in her abdomen for no reason whatsoever. He was arrested but the woman did not press charges. DeRoos later told Hepting that he thought it was her he stabbed. Sarah Hepting said the second instance of DeRoos' violence was when he suddenly started to strangle her for no reason, when they were having dinner. She said that was the last straw and the reason she left him. After Rita Curran's case was declared solved, even though her parents unfortunately died without knowing her killer, her living family and friends remembered her and were glad that they finally have closure. Jim Rabar, Rita Curran's second-grade student, remembered her as a kind and beautiful person. He said, "We actually did a play the year that I had her. I forgot what the play was about, but I was a dancing clown holding a teddy bear. She told me that I could keep the teddy bear and I still have the teddy bear, I just can't find it." Her sister, Mary Curran Campbell said, "We now have 2 generations in our family who never knew her." Tom Curran, her brother, said, "I don't think so much about the guy who did this as I do about Rita and my parents and what they went through. I pray to my parents, and I pray to Rita." Closing the case, Lieutenant Trabe said, "We're all confident that William DeRoos is responsible for the aggravated murder of Rita Curran, but because he died in a hotel room of a drug overdose, he will not be held accountable for his actions, but this case will be closed."